So I'd like to share today some reflections from the field. And you can consider this as postcards from the edge. And building and strategizing for disruptive innovations, as mentioned in the introduction. So I'll focus today on early stage innovation and navigating partnership potentials and pitching internally to win the battle of funds within your own company and achieving a position in the company pipeline. This is often very challenging, especially when you're looking at something disruptive and new. So these reflections are from 23 years of my regulatory strategy experience, with focus on the last several years on novel and disruptive innovation projects. So I'm happy to be here today, and as mentioned, I have 23 years of regulatory experience in large company, and I'm currently VP and Head of Regulatory Affairs at Ellume, which is a digital diagnostic company. So these thoughts are my own. So some acknowledgement up front. My talk and experience has been supported by the work from Clayton Christensen and a class I took with him at Harvard Business School online called Disruptive Strategy, and as well as Columbia's own Professor Rita McGrath, and specifically her courses and specifically her book, Seeing Around Corners. And the work of Salim Ismail and Peter Diamandis on exponential organizations, abundance versus scarcity mindset, and Simon Sinek's Start with Why. So let's get into it. The inciting incident. You have the classic S-curve, but you have an innovation project in play. You're testing efficacy, you're testing the business model. And having achieved company agreement, you're in this position. And then suddenly, you lose funding to continue. So what actually happened here? And when we start this curve, we're all aiming to get to that inflection point. And we do everything we can to get to that inflection point. So the question is, what happened? And as you can see, the X there is, it dropped. The project dropped before you got to that inflection point. So you're left frustrated because you've not had enough time to test to prove. You lost against competing priorities, where the focus is put on perhaps core innovation, what's known and predictable. And you question whether your senior leadership team understood the aim and the purpose. Did you do a good job advocating internally? So as I tried to understand these situations, I got great advice from innovation leaders within industry and other companies, and learned that there was common experiences here. And some of the advice I got was, well, are you aligned to the business growth pillars? When you are, you actually are ahead of the game, because by definition, if you're aligned to a company growth pillar, you've already got alignment to funding and to this pillar as being the idea of where innovations are requested to build that growth pillar. So you have access to that positioning. But you also need to reflect on whether you have the experts and expertise to shape the unmet need and value proposition. So we opened this summit this week with, it's all about the data. And so if you think about the great artists in our time and their impact on the human experience, you think about sculpting from marble, and how David was revealed from the chunk of marble. How did that happen? It took great precision, mastery. patience, painstaking strategy, focusing on a meaningful output. So you're not just producing something just to produce something. You're not taking shortcuts just to get it done. If you want to be differentiated, you have to have some level of mastery and the skills to bring that disruptive innovation forward, because by definition, it's something new and novel. So do you have the experts and expertise and skills in-house to educate internally, to educate the regulators on the unmet need and the appropriate data and go-to-market strategy? So one of my mantras is innovation shapes regulations. It shapes and forms the basis of regulatory advocacy. And also, clinical data is an asset. It's not a negative cost. So your business case should really amplify this asset. That's the goal. So it became clear to me that many had a different interpretation of the innovation in question. And when I say many had different interpretation, I mean within your own project team, the different cross-functional areas. And as I talked to strategists in other companies, it reflected a similar dilemma. And as we saw on day one here, it takes a village. This includes your internal village and your external village. So I often found that eyes glaze over when discussing details of strategy, when filling out project management tools like the total product profile and stage gate documents. What was lacking is an interconnected visual to focus the attention and maintain alignment throughout the project lifespan. So I started to frame a hub and spoke model to bring the strategy to life. And this can be adapted as you go through, you get data and you make data-driven changes. Now, there are many other spokes that will be in this wheel, and I minimized it for the purpose of time here. But of course, this is underpinned by safety first, by a culture of quality, by data privacy and ethics and compliance. So your fundamental start is, what is the problem that you are trying to solve? And amazingly, this is oftentimes not clear. And as I mentioned, different cross-functional groups may have a different interpretation of what the problem is that you're trying to solve. So this is really important to get solid right up front. And in discussions yesterday, I became aware of a book called What's Your Problem? To solve your toughest problems, change the problems you solve. And this is a book by Thomas Wildesberg. And he talks about the importance of spending time on this versus jumping straight into solutions. And I couldn't agree more. So next, you need to think about who are you solving the problem for? And that's the heart, the center. And these are your consumers, your patients, your healthcare professionals, the individuals, the users of the innovation that you are intending. Will they follow through with adoption? And here's a question. Do they care if the problem is actually solved? Are they going to engage with it? Does it really make a difference? You also need to consider what's in the landscape. Who else is focused on this? And more recently, I started to frame innovation ideas to leadership teams and part of my own leadership team of the company, defining the risk of not doing this, not doing the disruptive innovation. With novel ideas, you don't always have all the information up front. You're not relying on historical information when you're framing your proof of concept in your early idea. So by definition, this is the case with disruptive innovation. So instead of asking internally, does a company agree with this idea? Rather, I started to ask, is there a reason not to do this? Is there a reason not to go forward? So flipping the script of the strategic alignment approach and discussion, there is a risk of not doing something. If you rely on core innovation and you are primed for disruption, there is definitely a risk of not doing something. And this is insight of experience with listening to the discussions of Livongo. So as you look at the landscape, you consider what surround sound do you need to enable success of your innovation in the market. So is there a convergence with other technologies that will help to increase the value to accelerate the adoption of your innovation? Knowing the problem, knowing the user, you need to frame the intended use. What is the mechanism of action? What is the innovation actually doing? And oftentimes very early I'll be asked, okay, so what's the regulatory approach? Well, first we need to understand what actually are you trying to do? What's the purpose of the innovation? And rather than force-fitting it into a regulatory approach, let's understand, let's frame what that innovation is, and then that will be what it is. And you can slot it into the correct regulatory approach rather than force-fitting it. So what data supports the product purpose? Use your experts to define the unmet need and the data approaches and the requirements. When you think of a regulatory submission, keep in mind, you are telling a story. So what's your strategy? Your strategy is the plot and the subplots of that story. So frame this to describe and achieve a positive benefit-risk ratio. And meet early with regulatory authorities, such as FDA, for example. And as I discuss this with teams, I like to mirror a seed funding-like approach to a regulatory strategy. So when and how often do you meet with the regulatory authorities? You want to give them updates as you develop and get feedback on key milestones. So similar to how you would frame your seed funding approach, you also have to go against when you achieve certain milestones and achieve that progression of funding. And this is important to prepare for that regulatory engagement and getting the feedback. It is possible to go in too early. And keep in mind, you're the expert of this innovation. So go into FDA, into the regulatory authorities, but you're the expert, so you should have a position. Go in with a position and defend it. Let it be a dialogue. Let it be a conversation. Don't have it be open-ended. Go with your approach and understand the feedback. So as you further frame the plot of this story, consider the relevant global strategy and requirements up front so you can optimize development timelines after your first initial launch and your broader go-to-market strategy. Take into account supply chain strategy. Oftentimes, where you actually manufacture impacts which countries you can actually go forward in. Account for post-launch ideas up front. What real-world evidence can be possible with your innovation and your launch strategy? Try to think of this in advance so that you can frame your further strategy on pipeline achievements after your initial launch to keep the relevance and longevity of your innovation and support your product growth with lifecycle changes and really building that pipeline. So you're not one and done. Ensure you have the methods and resources for compliance and product maintenance. Post-launch, this is often not considered an early stage. And when you have a new and novel and disruptive technology, you will have to create different methods of compliance measurement. You're going to have to understand what parameters you should monitor and get agreement with that up front with the regulators as well. So the more you consider the resources you need and what teams you need to build, the earlier you do that, the better off you'll be to make your launch timing, but actually to support the product and market. So keep alignment with your true north as a company and against those business pillars. So as I started to observe this innovation strategy wheel and the hub and spokes and getting this wheel to turn, getting into motion, I realized that this frames very nicely with Simon Sinek's golden circle and framing the why, how, and what. So Simon says, people don't buy what you do, they buy why you do it. So does your why ladder up to your brand purpose? Do you need a new brand to be the carrier of this new innovation? Does it align with your business unit purpose, your company's growth pillars and mission? And as you go through framing this, as the circle describes, you have greater influence and longevity potential when you've defined this very clearly up front. And hopefully you can then avoid being dropped before you reach the inflection point on the S curve and end up on the cutting room floor. So hopefully you can see, yes, regulatory affairs can be creative and innovative. Involve us early in your innovation considerations. This is important feedback to get early on. And the earlier you engage, the better off you'll be to adapt the problem that you're trying to solve, to adapt to the right strategy. If you engage too late, well, then you have less opportunity and you might end up in the situation of being on the cutting room floor because you didn't make that inflection point. So if you'd like to discuss strategy further, I can be reached here or on LinkedIn. And thank you so much for your time and best wishes to this tribe for advancing healthcare. Thank you.